This is the common wisdom of the day, passed down from gods know which saint or anti-saint, which prophet or non-prophet, that the dead are merely delayed in their passing into the past, held in this world by the psychic aftershock of the troubled times, that it is best to ignore the dead and go about one's day, that eventually the dead will slide inexorably into the empty realms where they belong.
Hello and welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. Today is Tuesday, the 9th of July. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, Assistant Editor at Himal Southasian, coming to you from Colombo, and here with us today is Vajra Chandrasekera, who is also from Colombo but is joining us today from New York to talk about his debut novel, The Saint of Bright Doors, and his second and most recent novel, Rakesfall. The Saint of Bright Doors has won the Locus, Nebula, and Crawford Awards and is a finalist for the 2024 Hugo Award for Best Novel. Vajra's non-fiction poetry and over 50 short stories have appeared in magazines and anthologies including Analog, Black Static, Clark's World, the Los Angeles Times, among others. He has worked as an editor for Strange Horizons and Afterlives, the year's best death stories, and as a judge for the Dream Foundry Writing Contest and the Salam Award. In The Saint of Bright Doors, Vajra paints a vivid picture of a city on the brink, tracing Fetter's path from child assassin raised to kill his saintly father to misguided adult with the ability to see devils, anti-gods, and the magical traces of their world, like the mysterious bright doors. In blending the mundane and fantastical with violence of colonialism, religious control, and the struggles against these systems, the book captures the complex power structures that shape us. But one lifetime is not enough to tell some stories. Rakesfall is a complex portrait of death and reincarnations. This cross-genre science fiction epic following two souls as they reincarnate and echo across alternate realities, the mythic past to modern Sri Lanka, its long-drawn civil war to a far future Earth abandoned by humanity. We see how those in power consolidate their hold on society, even to the point of strangling it again and again. It's about the rise and fall of empires, how every attempt to make imperial power last forever fails and is always vulnerable to rebellion. At its core, The Saint of Bright Doors and Rakesfall explores the connectedness of struggles for liberation and how they reoccur in different contexts of oppression. Vajra, first, a huge congratulations on all the wins for The Saint of Bright Doors and on the release of Rakesfall, and welcome to the South Asia Review of Books podcast. It's great to have you joining us to talk about these stunning new books.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
I wanted to start off by asking you about the layering of South Asian myths, histories, and colonial and religious invasions and occupations that find mention in both books. Could you tell us about these references and also how you've presented them as critiques of racialization and violence against religious minorities that continue to date in various forms in Sri Lanka and beyond?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that this is one of the major themes of all my work, not only my fiction, but also my essays, my social media for that matter, and frankly, one of my most common topics of conversation. Um, I think the reformulation of South Asian religions in the imperial mold through the colonial era has had and continues to have profound and dire effects on all our lives in the region. As Sinhala Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Hindutva in India both perform the same kind of ideological role, right, for state-sanctioned ethno-religious supremacism. So for us, I think as much as or possibly more than like other regions, given how intense that ideological role can be, mythology, history, and quotidian politics all occupy this single seamless spectrum for us of like thought and action. Elections are decided based on mythic callbacks to ancient epics or fantasy heroes, effectively, legendary wars. So modernity in South Asia, I think, requires of all of us that we become deeply literate in fantasy because we seem to be spending so much of our political and cultural lives navigating it.
Thank you for that, Vajra. That was really well said. And just to add to that, in The Saint of Bright Doors and Rakesfall, there are references to colonial institutions and the renaming of places in post-colonial contexts. So could you tell us about how you've chosen to highlight how places, myths, and histories are erased and manipulated and even weaponized, and how the ways in which we interact with our own pasts are distorted by these colonial narratives?
Yeah. You know about Operation Legacy, right? It was in the era of decolonization or recolonization under different protocols, you might say. The British Colonial Office had a formal policy between the 50s through to the 70s of destroying vast amounts of records around the world, the records that would have exposed various colonial crimes to the newly independent colonies. It was called Operation Legacy. So they set fire, quite literally, most of the time, I think, to the historical record in order to erase the actionable evidence and effectively to destroy memory in a very literal way. Right? So in much the same way that the colonial era had already destroyed so much of what it had conquered in the process of what was unironically considered its civilizing mission. And then in our lifetimes, in the so-called post-colonial era, this is what the former colonies also inherited, right? The same toolkit of history, burning, violence. Like many post-colonial states, such as Sri Lanka, begin that post-independence history in these tremendous exercises of what can only be called colonial violence, like the Ceylon Citizenship Act in the late 40s and the Sinhala-only Act in the mid 50s. So these were the inherited colonial tools by which an ethno-religious supremacist elite political culture ensures its demographic and political domination in the decades to come. And that's also rooted in the same kind of erasure of people, of language, of history, with the same toolkit of rewriting history to the convenience of a ruling class, basically. So Operation Legacy was itself that the actual Operation Legacy from the British Colonial Office, I think by that point it was called the British Foreign Office, was still active in the 70s, in the decade before the burning of the Jaffna Library, which was one of the major precursors of the war in Sri Lanka. So those are, in many ways, the same project, right? They're done by different people, but like ideologically and operationally, they feel like they belong to the same project. Because to destroy history thoroughly, it isn't enough to just burn the records. It has to be replaced with a more convenient narrative, right? So in Sri Lanka, that was a project that had been going since the late 19th century, with the Buddhist revival of the late 19th century, which is complete with the colonial recovery of the Mahavansa in the most toxic interpretation it could possibly have been given. So these colonial anthropologists and kind of aggressively toxic anti-colonial ideologues taking these old texts with their complicated, entangled, many times translated histories, and then instead of reading them for the perhaps useful complexities that they could have offered into our view of the past, texts like the Mahavansa become these singular, streamlined, simplistic narratives of effectively manifest destiny and genocide denial. So in becoming these blunt ideological weapons, it destroys the very history that it claims to recover, right? It makes an oversimplified anti-colonial history, which is itself a colonial weapon, even long after the empire has formally removed itself from this territory. So these multiple erasures, these layers of forgettings, erasures, and kind of tactical political retellings are one of the themes that I'm kind of trying to talk about especially in the Saint of Bright Doors, which is about erasure, retelling, the forgetting, forcible erasure of memory, and making people lose access to themselves in a way, to remember something other than their own histories.
Since we're on the topic of places, let's talk about geography in the Saint of Bright Doors. You've presented this world upside down, I think, kind of like Himal's own right-side-up map of South Asia. Was this a deliberate choice to invert and resist colonial maps, or the concept of Jambudvipa or Akhanda Bharat the idea of a unified, undivided India that's nurtured by the Hindu nationalist RSS?
Yes, very much so. It was very much a deliberate choice, and I absolutely did think of Himal's right side up map when I was writing this. Because if I remember right, that map came out in the mid 20 teens, right? And I had seen that already. I wrote this in 2020. So I've always loved maps that highlight the arbitrariness of mapping conventions. There are all kinds of alternate maps that do that, right? Maps that, for example, highlight the arbitrariness of the Mercator projections and like how, like the Africa and Asia are shrunk and Europe enlarged for arbitrary reasons, essentially. And this is the right side up map is another one of those that like, why is North up? There's no reason for North to be up. So I needed a map for the Saint of Bright Doors that was both familiar and strange. And this was one way in which things could be completely different, but also kind of staying the same, right? And I also enjoyed, I think, something else the Saint of Bright Doors does with maps is the reversal of the temporality of continental drift. So instead of the conventional separation of the island from the subcontinent, we have this sudden cataclysmic rejoining of the two. So that's another way in which the map changes. And mapping, of course, like Akanpa, that in particular is like a way of, has also been one of these kind of forms of toxic fascistic anti-colonialism, like the kind of like nationalism that comes in the wake of colonialism and wears the skin of like anti-colonial thought, which I think both India and Sri Lanka have seen a lot of. It's like it's setting itself against British imperialism, but really what it's about is blaming like minorities and justifying a different kind of local fascism. So, and mapping is a big part of that.
Yeah, I thought that was brilliant, so thank you. Before we welcome you to present 2 short readings from your books, I'd like to take a moment to invite our listeners to check out our Patreon program to support Himal's independent journalism, including some of the most wide-ranging book reviews from around the region, that relies on the support of our listeners like you. Southasia Reviewer Books is a podcast and a monthly newsletter that threads together our latest reviews and literary essays. You'll find a special reading list curated by Vajra Chandrasekera in this month's edition, so do sign up for the newsletter to keep up with our latest reviews, podcasts, and more. Now, Vajra, over to you to read 2 excerpts from The Saint of Bright Doors and Rakesfall.
All right, I have picked out a couple of short excerpts. So the first reading is from The Saint of Bright Doors. Well, since the book is called The Saint of Bright Doors, this is the main character, Fetter, and in his first actual up-close encounter with the Bright Doors. The Bright Doors of Luriat give the city its historic identity without intruding on its daily life. For Fetter's first year living in the city, there is too much to see, and the brightly painted doors scattered around the city seem unremarkable. After a while, though, he notices how they're always closed, and how often there is somebody working on these doors, repainting them always in bright primary colors, testing, oiling, repairing the hinges, the locks, the knobs, filling in gouges or scars with putty, varnishing, polishing, wiping away stains, lighting incense, leading circles of prayer before them, shining ultraviolet flashlights, taking carefully flaked samples of the wood, the paint, leaving flowers, leaving small offerings of neatly sliced fruit and joss sticks with their thready smoke. The bright doors are distinct from ordinary doors, which don't receive such attentions, and which are often, Fetter notices eventually, not doors at all. There are plenty of simple, unobstructed openings in walls, arches and curtains of cloth or beads or translucent plastic sheeting, glass doors of varying degrees of translucency, half doors or doors with inset windows, screens of netting, metal gates or grates, bars like cages. An ordinary Luriati door is always partly open or partly transparent, even if imperfectly. Only the bright doors are fully closed and opaque. From this, Fetter gathers that it is the lack of transparency, the closing of doors, the unknowability of another side, that differentiates the bright doors from mere entrances. One day, unable to resist curiosity, he approaches a bright door on the street. He was walking the city, following nothing but his luck, when he happened across a rare, unattended bright door. Nobody is fussing around it or keeping an eye on it. There are no police or witnesses. It's set in the wall of an unremarkable building, which otherwise seems to house nothing but a luxury jeweler's shop. The entrance to the shop is an ordinary glass door set into the shop front, as far away from the bright door as possible. It's early in the morning and the shop is closed, the street deserted. He walks up to the bright door and tries the knob. It's locked. The wood is painted a cheerful orange, and up close you can see that the paint is thick and inexpert, with too many layers, stray brush strokes, and clumps. There are no signs or writing on it or near it indicating danger or warning people away. He rattles the knob and becomes conscious of cold air seeping through the gaps where the door meets its frame. It's not the even chill of air conditioning or refrigeration. It's the rustling whisper of a cold wind carrying an unfamiliar, bitter smell. The more conscious Fetter grows of the cold wind, the stronger and louder it seems, as if there is a gusting, howling wind behind the bright door, the kind of wind that might be funneled through a mountain pass. At first, he thinks it's the cold that unsettles him, when in point of fact, Laureate is a city at low elevation, bordering the ocean, where the air is always warm, occasionally temperate, and the wind comes from the sea. But then he thinks it's the smell he doesn't recognize, the way it's almost a taste on his tongue, like ash. Or it's the way the chill in that air feels like the outdoors, even though it's coming, by definition, from indoors, or at least from behind the door. If what's behind the door is the outside, then does that make all of Laureate, all of the world, the inside? The wind from the other side seems to intensify, as if there's a storm being held back by nothing more than this thin, over-painted orange door. The knob is freezing cold in his hand, though he can't tell if it was cold when he touched it. Perhaps it was, so cold that it numbed the skin of his palm. He lets it go, rubbing his palms together. When he takes a few steps away from the door, the gusts of cold wind recede, as does the sense of heavy weather on the other side. He has a headache, squatting in the darkest corner of his temple, beating like an extra heart. And that was a short excerpt from The Saint of Bright Doors. I shall switch seamlessly to Rakesfall and read a small excerpt from that as well. The first maggot drops onto Vidyuchika's hand while she stood in front of her stove, the flame burning a little too high in this closed and yellow room. The wriggler is dirty white against her brown, swimming in the thick film of her sweat. She twitches it away, but she doesn't scream. She wants to, but the shriek catches in her throat, and she coughs and retches and has to keep herself from puking instead. She doesn't even realize how hard she's gripped the wrist of her contaminated hand until she feels the blood stop flowing, roiling and damp. Her fever is rising again, and the inside of her head is soft and furry and warm. Maggots eat dead tissue. She's not dead, therefore it can't eat her. But there's the bad smell again, high and sweet, like decomposition. A sharp note rising above the smell of cooking food. Either her fever is spiking again, or there's something dead above her head. She looks up and sees another maggot about to fall. She backs away. The maggots are falling from the imperfect joints between the loose panels of the ceiling. "Go away, lumberjacker," she says to the haunting corpse above. "I know it was my fault, stupid hair. I get it already." The corpse crawls away. The ceiling panels bulge and shift under its hands and knees. "And take your maggots with you." Lumberjaver's body has followed her from home to home, always hiding in the ceilings, crawling in the walls. It's a haunting. It's a curse. Many people are cursed, and even more are haunted after the pogroms of the troubled time. So she thinks for a while that she can blend into the city's shared suffering. It has been 10 years since the troubled times. or 10 days, or 10 hours. It feels recent, but Vidvichika checks herself to be sure. She's a grown young woman, again, not a child, still or again. Therefore, time has passed. But that time came folded in on itself, like a thick sheaf of paper in a letter, like a long, long letter from someone she loved who went far away. She's never had a letter like that. Everyone who might have sent her one died in worlds gone by. She imagines letters from the land of the dead, envelopes stained with funeral ash, delivered by a dead postman riding a bicycle with flat tires, rims squealing as he pedals. In the first apartment building that she moves into in the city's free housing, the body goes unnoticed for at least a month. There was still blood in the hallways and ghost fires on every street. At that time, the bar for haunting was quite high. It was the falling, crawling maggots that finally got her neighbors to complain. In her new apartment, she is more hopeful. Her new landlady sighed when told about the maggots, then shook her head in that mobile spiral that in the subcontinent means a qualified yes, a can do, and oh well, what are you going to do about that? Vidvichika does her best to clean up after herself and Lumberjigger. Sometimes she considers climbing up on a chair, pushing those loose panels out of the way to confront him face to face. She suggests this to her landlady, who clucks. That's not how it works, daughter, her landlady says. That's not how it works at all. This is the common wisdom of the day, passed down from gods know which saint or anti-saint, which prophet or non-prophet, that the dead are merely delayed in their passing into the past, held in this world by the psychic aftershock of the troubled time, that it is best to ignore the dead and go about one's day, that eventually the dead will slide inexorably into the empty realms where they belong. We are not ignoring the problem, the city insists. We are intentionally and mindfully waiting for the problem to go away on its own. And that, yes, that was Rakesfall.
Thank you for those excellent readings, Vajra. And I have to say, that section from Rakesfall was definitely one of my favorites.
Mine too, actually.
Oh, is it? I actually was curious to know which one would have been your favorites. Was this one of the stories published earlier as a short story?
No. This is original to Rakesfall. Most of Rakesfall by volume is new.
Mm-hmm.
This was the part of Rakesfall that is actually set in Noria, the same city as the Saint of Bright Rose. But so it's the closest thing that I've written to a sequel. Of course, there are no like repeating characters, but there are some hints that this is the world not long after the events of the Saint of Bright Rose.
Yeah, I was surprised to find the perfect and kind mentioned in that section as well. I was like, oh, hey. Okay. So even though the two books aren't directly connected, I found myself making a mental motherboard, if you will, of common threads and references between the two. And a few that really struck with me as a reader from Sri Lanka were the references to military checks and the violence of identity card regimes. There's mentions of burnt bodies with ties around their necks, disappearances, surveillance, broadly pointing to the Civil War, the anti-Tamil pogroms, and the JVP uprisings. And as we mentioned up top, the books are about different struggles for liberation against state violence and how these are interconnected, including struggles against violent ideologies backed by state powers. So tell us about creating literature that is political and how your writings and these two books pull from these complex histories of state repression and atrocities.
Well, I grew up in the Sri Lanka that was at war with itself, and which in all ways but one, it has never stopped, really. It's not only that this was and is the culture which shaped and continues to shape our personhood. I think a generation's way of looking at the world. It's that a consequence of that shaping is that Sri Lanka's many manifestations of state violence are like how I and I think many others in my generation understand the operation of a state in the first place. Right? This is how it's through that lens that we understand what politics even is. So I think being political is a definitionally necessary and load-bearing pillar of what art is in the first place. So the question is rather, how do you make art intentionally and meaningfully political? How do you make the politics of your work liberatory rather than thoughtlessly monstrous? I'm ignoring people who make monstrous art on purpose, of course. But a lot more people make art that falls into this tendency, right? Reactionary, monstrously political art by default, without intention. Because they think it's possible to simply be entertaining with no further thought or engagement with the work, right? I don't think that's possible. Even the shallowest entertainment is inevitably nose deep in the politics of at least two worlds, both of which could be described as dimensions of the conditions of its production. One is the product. I wrote an essay about this a while back as well. One of those dimensions is the productive or industrial dimension, which where we might talk about questions like, were the people who made art fairly compensated for their labor? Were their rights stolen? In what ways do these corporate media conglomerates that essentially control publishing benefit at the expense of the creators whose effort and art and ingenuity produced the object of art that was then sold as a commodity? Or like broader questions like AI, for example, like how industrialized plagiarism engines like AI being used to make creative work more precarious and paid even more poorly, while also systematically destroying, wasting people's ability to make art at all, which is in direct contradiction to what I think is a core principle of the artist's politics, which is that every human being has the potential to be an artist and should have the opportunity to learn, to articulate their own unique expression of art. But that's all of this belongs to what you might call what I call the industrial dimension of the politics of art. But alongside that, and I think harder to see, is the ideological dimension of the politics of art, which is an example I've been using a lot lately when talking about this, is when Netanyahu was on TV justifying genocide with this image of the children of light, quote unquote, versus the children of darkness, which is straight up epic fantasy imagery. Of course, fantasy didn't invent that imagery, which long predates the novel, but it's just larger than life idea, right? This epic, supernatural, and fundamentally xenophobic idea, which is one of the oldest articulations of racism and xenophobia, and part of the ideological armament of like power and ruling classes throughout history, especially in the long colonial and imperial age, which is say of like modernity, like the world we actually live, where like scientific racism and like the separation of like peoples into these like categories have determined and clearly continue to determine the fate of millions of people. So modern epic fantasy, for example, that thoughtlessly recapitulates these same ideas, these same images, the children of light, children of darkness, these are the battles between the two, where there's a clear sort of like good and evil, which is kind of like racially determined, is performing ideological work, whether the author intends to or not. It's performing ideological work in reinforcing that these are meaningful ways to think that this is acceptable politics for like an adult human being in like the 21st century. And this is what I mean when I say there's an ideological dimension to the work of art, because I think artists have a responsibility to actually think about the ideas and the concepts and the histories that lie underneath, and usually not that far underneath these images and tropes that might be used shallowly for the sake of quote unquote entertainment or escapism. So for art to be political is to understand that we are cultural workers in a very dense media environment, and that we work with the same mythic and symbolic iconographies that are in use all around us, and that have these existing histories of deployment in the class struggle and scientific racism and Orientalism of like decades and centuries that come before us, right? Like what we do with these iconographies as they pass through our hands is our responsibility.
Thank you for that, Vajra. And towards the end of Rakesfall, the oligarchs, or how you describe as the leaders of thought and nations who have ended up destroying the world, are now trying to escape what they've destroyed, which for me speaks to this same kind of recklessness of capitalism, and is also a callback to the commentary you've made in the past about how science fiction and speculative fiction in general is not automatically progressive or harmlessly escapist in the way that a lot of people assume it is. So could you tell us more about this?
Yes, this is very much the I have been saying this for years. Yes, we've all seen the torment nexus meme, right? Where like someone in Silicon Valley invents the fictional torment nexus, and the meme goes, we have invented the torment, finally invented the torment nexus from the classic science fiction novel. Don't invent the torment nexus, which is a little bit how like what the news looks like in recent years, and especially with this with long-termism and that kind of like set of belief systems. For people who are unaware, like I think Timnit Gebru and Emil Petores call it Tescrealism. Tescreal is an acronym that groups together this bunch of very jargony, largely interchangeable keywords like transhumanism, singularitarianism, extropianism, long-termism, effective altruism. All these things mean like basically the same thing or similar set of things. I don't even remember what all of them are. All of these things sound superficially positive to somebody who's unfamiliar with them, like what's wrong with quote unquote long termism. And most of these, or all of them, really are science fictional. Sometimes drawing literally on specific texts or authors for inspiration, like Werner Vinge, for example. Or even particularly like in like wild misreadings, even authors whose politics would be opposed to all of this. Like, for example, Elon Musk professes to be a fan of Ian Banks, which is ridiculous, really. Some of this actually is very literally very torment nexus, because many authors wrote about these things to demonstrate how and why they would make things worse, like Charles Stross or David Zinder, for example. So what all the terms covered in this acronym, textualism, have in common is this kind of techno-fetishist ethos aimed at bringing about this imaginary far future where billionaires can become gods, essentially upload their minds into computers, live forever, like untethered by the constraints of of the body, of like mere physicality or like material like constraints. So this is essentially a religious cult, one that's highly influential in Silicon Valley today, based on like a handful of dated science fiction tropes that were highly compatible with like kind of like the neoliberal turn of the 1980s, and were in fact produced then in the 1980s. In what I always thought was kind of a in science fiction, what was kind of a techno-reactionary backlash to the preceding generation of science fiction, which at that point was doing quite a lot of interesting work, like the feminist SF of the 70s, for example, like Le Guin or John Ross, or the British New Wave of Ballard and Moorcock, or Delaney in the States. So there was a time when science fiction was getting smarter, better written, more conscious of itself as an art form, and more social aware. So, of course, by the 80s in the neoliberal term, it was time for like a big backlash of like capitalist hyperrealism. And a big part of that was this new dualism of like abandoning the flesh and escaping the ordinary world into this new and exciting cyberspace where you could do anything without worrying about the world. And these ideas seeped into kind of the smooth brains of the people who would make billions of dollars in the neoliberal decades, like the Silicon Valley, like oligarchs to come. And that now it has fermented into this faith, which is strong enough to entirely discount the real world, right? The present day, in the favor of like the imaginary whims of future AI gods, who these people want to first worship and then become, I think, which is okay. To be fair, you could say that long-termism isn't really science fiction's fault. It's one of my favorite like phrases. Long-termism is science fiction's fault, and you could say that's not true, because like both this kind of like bizarre cultish thinking and the kind of science fiction that I love so much are both like simultaneously products of the same kind of neoliberal capitalist like superstructure in the modern kind of internet modernity era, and they both come out of the same set of beliefs, which is as much about like neoliberal capitalism as a kind of latent Christian eschatology, mind-body dualism, and this kind of deep-seated psychological need, I think, which comes with that neoliberal capitalism, to ignore externalities in favor of like to separate those things, like to ignore the parts where like who gets hurt, who gets ripped off, whose planet gets set on fire, in favor of focusing on technology instead of exploitation as the driver of capital P progress. But I say long-termism is science fiction false because I like to make that connection more explicit as a reader and writer of science fiction, because I want to highlight that idea that the symbols and myths can be just as dangerous as a kind of radioactive toxic waste. If you don't want billionaire kaiju slithering out of the sewers in 30 years' time, you have to be careful what you're putting into the water, right? And that is what we are dealing with now. What went into the water in the 1980s is resulting in like this generation of billionaires like thrashing about and like dumping this like toxic like AI nonsense on top of us now, with like data centers sucking up like power and wasting water in an age when those resources are growing ever more scarce, and when the damage is being hit especially hard in, for example, South Asia, in exchange for like stupid chatbots like would for as toys for people to play with in the first place.
Thank you for that, Vajra. Super interesting stuff.
That was a bit of a rant, I admit, but
not at all. So I also wanted to ask you about the different manifestations of gender and queerness in both books. The gender dysphoria that's visible in parts of Rakesfall, and also the centering of queer relationships of Fetter, the perfect and kind, and Mother of Glory in The Saint of Bright Doors. That also acknowledges the kind of very real existence of homophobia and colonial laws that are actively used against queer people in the present day.
Yeah. Then homophobia and queerphobia in general is like, especially in this part of the world, like a colonial intervention as legally institutionalized in the 19th century, right? Like, I think all of us like have the experience of like, protesting like the same set of like homophobic laws in our penal codes from the same period. Like in Sri Lanka, that's about section 365 and 365A of the penal code, which is like British colonial norm, violently upheld by the Sri Lankan state to this day. In India, in India penal code, I think it's 377, which is like in literally more or less the same language, the same like codes. Same, I think it's 377 in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Malaysia. Like everywhere touched by the British Empire, they left behind these same kind of set of imperial revulsions and the same legal language, the same penal code, the same instrument, the same like legal tools of homophobia and queerphobia. So the same kind of like norms that we inherited, part of that same erasing and rewriting of history that we talked about, where like retrofitting like much of the world to these perverse English sexual norms of a certain period. And we, as a result, now can not really access the culture that preceded it. Like we believe it to have been otherwise, but we can't really access it anymore, right? Now we have to contend with like the world that was made, but we can understand like some things from the culture that is succeeding that, right? Like our culture, which teaches us is nothing else that like that people are incredibly diverse in how we structure like our insides and present our outsides. I think, and it's funny in a way because like the words like gender and genre as nouns, they come from the same place, right? Like it's the same word, Latin via French. They both mean like a particular class of like a thing or like a particular kind of thing. So speculative fiction is part of what we normally call genre fiction, as distinct from literary fiction. So genre in this sense is like romance, crime, science fiction, fantasy, horror, whatever. And many of these works like are in a way queer, like they're cross genre, which is also called various things like slipstream or interstitial or whatever, in that they inhabit or pass through the forms of multiple genres, just like gender in people, which is also something like this. Like in both cases, there are various forms or tropes that we can inhabit, that we can move closer to or further away from. It's a question of what is expected of us, how we present ourselves to be read by others. And it can be very discomforting when a text that you wrote, because that text can be yourself, as one thing is read as something else, right? And text and people are best read on their own terms. So Rakesfall in its entirety is a work of genre dysphoria, if you like. And one of the mechanisms of the repeated self-flaying device is to demonstrate in the narrative this continual process of peeling away the skin of one form, one kind of story, one kind of personhood, to expose another one beneath. I also wanted to write books that were that kind of normalized various kinds of queer normalcy, of a queer being, without trying to suggest some kind of like airy utopia where all these problems were solved. So, which is why those like the same penal codes are there for example, the Saint of White Toes, where Mother Fleur literally warns Fetter against them. And in that world, those laws work much in the same way as they do in ours. So I feel like you can't talk about the one without acknowledging the other, that those struggles are very much ever present. And no matter how much even though we have made various kinds of progress, we have also like a long way to go, and those struggles are part of that.
Thank you for that, Vajra. And I think it's super interesting what you said about how genre has the same roots of the word as gender. And somewhere else you mentioned that fantasy has the same meaning as to, I think, shine a light on or to shed light on, which again is very interesting, I think, how you play with these root words in your work. So that's super interesting. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I particularly love that particular etymology, because I think a lot of people think of fantasy as in terms of escapism, in terms as a looking away from the world, but I always see it as a way to shine a light, as in taking a big spotlight and shining it on some aspect of society, blowing it up and making it larger than life. But to me, it's about looking more closely rather than looking away.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you. So reading both books also took me on a tangent of looking for speculative fiction on Sri Lanka, when I stumbled across your excellent essay on authenticity in fiction and the extractivism of setting. You write that this is not about appropriation. This is about the problems of setting in fiction that troubles us all because we live in the same empire-haunted world, ruined by colony and post-colony alike. Sometimes the jungle is inauthentic, being merely colonial-era plantations gone back to the wild. Sometimes the jungle in question is urban, end quote. And I thought that was a very nice callback to the jungles that find mention in both your books. So could you tell us about writing science fiction fantasy from Sri Lanka and how you grapple with these questions? What are your reflections, anxieties, and hopes for this current moment of South Asian speculative fiction?
Yeah. When you're from this part of the world and you start writing, this kind of fiction, or really any kind of fiction, one of the things you instantly discover is that while the further back you go, the fewer writers there are from this part of the world who are actually publishing, there have always been works using this part of the world as prop, as exotic setting, as a kind of I think like that I say called the raw material of the imagination. Orientalism, essentially, it's a huge part of the history of both literary and speculative fiction, right? Because a great deal of classic science fiction is in any case about aliens and first contact and so forth, and that's essentially imperial anthropology in action, right? Like this is like lightly coded retellings of empire. What happens when Lorenzo di Almeida lands a ship on the shores of Sri Lanka and has cataclysmic effects on the natives. And I think for a long time, readers from our part of the world were so hungry for some scrap of recognition to be seen at all, even if we're seen in this deeply racist, monstrous ways, that like for years, if you asked people, or if you like look for like recommendations of like South Asian speculative fiction, for years you would find these awful, shitty books like Dan Simmons' Song of Kali, for example, from the 80s, which is absolutely god awful. And things like that racist shit book won a World Fantasy Award in like the 1980s, right? That was the state of things, not so long ago. And like, there are these deep ironies now when like writers from the third world finally are ourselves appearing in the same magazines, having books come out from the same publishers, sometimes even sharing bookshelves or recommendation lists with the same Orientalist fictions that were about us, right? So now at least we have real options, but it is which is nice. But at the same time, like recognition as a writer is something that needs time. Like you have to be published widely, read widely, remembered, reviewed, all that stuff. And there's something I said in that essay as well about, I believe I was in that essay, I was talking about like Mike Resnick and writers and like from Kenya and so forth. Like why Mike Resnick, a white American writer, got to be considered the canonical African writer by other white American editors at a certain period in time, because like, and that why how that mechanism works to take advantage of these deep structural advantages that left a lot of us like out of the loop. Whiteness, citizenship in the metropole, access to the publishing industry, all those things, right? So like those things are changing now, and I think in a third world speculative fiction in general is having a lot more visibility now in the 20 teens and 20s, and ironically, I think like it's that's happening partly for very simple material reasons rather than like it's not because like people in general got like more woke or whatever. That would be nice to think, but I don't think that's actually necessarily true. I think both the absences and the presences are driven by material reasons to some extent, with like simple access, right? Like one of the things that happened, like if you look back at the tables of contents of any major speculative fiction magazine, you won't see a lot of names from South Asia or from anywhere in the third world until the 20 teens. Then you start to see them, right? And then since then, like in the last decade and a half, maybe there has been a real explosion in terms of global diversity in those tables of contents, in the magazines, the anthologies, writers getting book deals, putting out novels. And I think that first, like the wave of like insofar as there is a wave, I mean, like, arguably, like this has been happening all the time. But like, I think like one of the big differences of what changed here is just the fact that the magazines, first the magazines and the publishers and the agents and all the parts, various moving parts of the industry started accepting online submissions in this century. By the 20 teens, it had become like standard practice for like all magazines, like all publishers, editors generally now accept online submissions. And there's all this information about how to like format your manuscript, how to like, how to like write a pitch, how to do this and that, like, a synopsis and like how to query an agent. All that stuff is now like stuff you can find online rather than like it being this mysterious. You no longer have to go schmooze people like in the US or whatever, which was once upon a time like how these things like work. So there was corresponding sharp rise in the global diversity of submissions from new writers, from like the third world, from like Africa, from Asia. People who started that practice like in the 20 teens, like the novelists among us at least, are now getting published in the West, right? Like we're publishing novels now because so we have this what seems like this sudden surge, but it's not that sudden because many of these writers have been working for some time. Like for example, Tashan Mehta has a new book out, I think like this year, no, last year, right? Mad Sisters of Essie, which I'm very much looking forward to and highly recommend even before I read it, because her first novel, The Liar's Wheel, which is brilliant, came out in 2017. I don't think it got as nearly as much exposure as it should have, which was, I think, was a problem for a lot of South Asian books from the 20 teens, that they didn't get the spotlight that they deserve. Like this is true of, for example, of like I think like a lot of books, especially in the West. Like I think like in India, in the Indian market, I think a lot of them got some attention, but in the West there was this very like that leap had not been made yet, that bridge had not been crossed, and that it's like is very like much a pity, and that's something that's changing now in the 2020s. For example, like the year that Liar's Weave came out was also the year that Indra Das's first novel, The Devourers, won a Lammy Award, right? So that was like, that should have been a much bigger deal for like the recognition of South Asian speculative fiction than I think it was in the West. Like, I feel like that was a brilliant book, and I feel like it hasn't got anywhere near the accolades it deserved. It didn't win a Lammy, thank God. It should have won more things. Indra also has a new award-nominated novel out this year, from Subterranean Press. It's called The Last Dragoners of Parbasa. Highly recommended. Samit Basu has been publishing for like 20 years now. And I think his most recent book, The Jinbot of Chandrasekera, was shortlisted for the Goodreads choice, for the Locust. So that's good. Now, like these are like, finally, I think like Samit is getting some like visibility in the West, whereas like, I think even his previous book, which is brilliant, which published in India, is Chosen Spirits. That was the version I read. It came out, I think, like a couple of years ago, maybe, as in the US, as The City Inside. which along with the Lies Weave and The Devourers is one of my favorite works of South Asian speculative fiction, among the very best, in my opinion, that the region has produced. So all of these writers demonstrate that South Asian speculative fiction has been here since the 2010s at the very least, like producing like these incredible works, and was always. What's changing now is both that there are more of us in the 2020s, and that we're getting more recognition in the West, and more access to the West. Like we're more able to publish in Western markets as distinct from purely like in the Indian market, which has been, I think, like a problem for like access. Like books would come out in India, but they would not be available for sale in the US. That would like be like a problem for like, even if you have like fans or readers who want to buy your book, you can't get it in the States, and then that causes like, then you don't get award nominations because like if your American fans aren't able to read your work, so all kinds of like issues, right? And so that is one very good change that is happening now, I think. Like, and for example, like another book that came out in India first, I think like to some attention in India, but like insufficient, like or possibly like no, like definitely insufficient attention in the West was Lavanya Lakshminarayan's 10% Thief, which came out in India under another title like a few years ago. It's up for a Clark Award this year as 10% Thief in the UK, which is wonderful because I think I would need to double check this, but like I've followed the Clark Award like fairly like closely for years, and I think Lavanya is the only South Asian writer other than Amitav Ghosh who won at one point for Calcutta Chromosome in the 90s. Apart from Amitav Ghosh, I think Lavanya is the only South Asian writer to be ever nominated for a Clark Award. So to tie into what we talked about earlier, there have absolutely been books nominated for a Clark Award before, which used South Asian settings written by white writers, right? But like only like in the history of the Clark Award, only possibly two writers, Amitav Ghosh and Lavanya Lakshminarayan, have actually appeared in the shortlist themselves. I love to see us writing rather than being written about. I think I just saw like very recently, Lavanya recently announced a new book coming out in November, which should be up for pre-order now, which is called Interstellar Mega Chef. It was described as Master Chef in space. And I feel like I know a lot of people who would be instantly intrigued by this. What else? Who has come out this year? I think in recent upcoming debuts, we have Amal Singh, The Garden of Delights, which just came out, I think, in April or May, from Flame Tree Press. I'm hearing a lot of good things. Amal's short fiction is great. And like me, he published short stories, really great short stories for like 10 years before his first novel came out. So this has been a long time coming. Prashant Srivatsa's The Spice Gate comes out this year again. So like this is a very busy year for South Asian speculative fiction. It comes out, I think, like literally next week. So you should absolutely pre-order it or buy it as soon as it comes out, because I have read that one ahead of time and it's excellent. It's really good. This year also we had Premi Mohammad's The Siege of Burning Grass, which came out, I think, in March. Is a phenomenally good fantasy novel about war and pacifism. Premi is an Indo-Caribbean writer based in Canada, and her work is so good that I want to see it listed in recommendations of Indo-Caribbean diaspora writers as well as South Asian diaspora writers, and I don't care, and Canadian writers. The more places it can be shouted out, the better, in my opinion. So I'm sure I'm going to remember like another 10 books like in like another hour, which I should have mentioned. But like these are the ones that are like popping into my head, and like so many of these books came out like either this year itself or in the 2020s, right? This is what I mean by like this new kind of like surge of South Asian writers, many of whom have been publishing for years, but are like now have work coming out in the West and getting more recognition for it. I think it's a good thing, and I think we are now in a situation where it is no longer possible actually for anyone to just off the top of their head list every South Asian speculative fiction author and every book of note in a quick summary. You can't do that anymore. And I think it's a sign of health, and hopefully it will become ever more impossible to keep up. So I think like please do check out all the books that I've mentioned. The spectrum of what people are writing is like, I think, now sufficiently vast and diverse in style and register and theme that there's bound to be something that works for every reader and any mood. So definitely do check it all out.
Thank you so much for those amazing recommendations. And you're absolutely right. I think It's been so great to see the explosion of speculative fiction coming out from South Asia. And I hope that the amazing wins for your book will kick open the doors to more recognition and more success for these works of South Asian speculative fiction. Forgive the pun with the doors there.
Thank you so much. And I actually completely forgot to mention Sri Lankan science fiction authors, which obviously we had a brilliant essay in Himal, right? Gautam Bhatia wrote this essay at Himal about Sri Lankan speculative fiction, and I feel like I really should shout this out because we have multiple award-winning Sri Lankan speculative fiction writers like Tina Kumar Gurunathan and Yudhanja Vijayaratna, and several new Sri Lankan writers who are just now publishing their first short stories, like Mega Spinell, who had a brilliant short story in Asimov's just a couple of years ago, who I very much hope to see new work from. Yudhanja has a new book coming out this year as well, in, I want to say, September. It's called Pilgrim Machines, which should be up for pre-order now. And Amanda Jayatissa, who is a Sri Lankan horror thriller writer, who has been putting out, I think, very nearly a book a year in the 2020s. I've only read the first one, My Sweet Girl, which is brilliant, and has a new one, which is either imminent or has just come out, called Island Witch, which sounds fascinating and is very high up on my TBR. I just wanted to make sure that I shouted out the Sri Lankan writers as well. That would be a very terrible omission on my part if I didn't.
No, yeah, those are excellent recommendations. I can't wait to pick them up myself. And Vajra, thank you again for a brilliant discussion and for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I want to say congratulations again for all the great awards you've collected, and we're rooting for many more wins for Saints and Rakesfall to come. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the South Asia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find Vajra Chandrasekera's reading list for the episode in this month's South Asia Review of Books newsletter. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian literature like no other. And that gives us a very unique community, viewpoint, and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to help us, please do become a Himal patron. We have a great program with lots of perks, including Himal's Right Side Up map, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic South Asia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.